You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
My name is Chuck Connerly. I'm director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning, and I'm really excited about a lecture that is going to be given by Robin Hambleton. I'll introduce him in just a minute. But this is an event sponsored by, as far as I know, this is the first event co-sponsored by the City of Iowa City and the School of Urban and Regional Planning and the Iowa Public Policy Center, the City of I almost said West Liberty. Maybe they should, but City of North Liberty and the City of Coralville. And the county. Oh, Rod, I knew. Where's Rod? Yes, lest we forget the county. So this is an exciting event to have all these different units, both university and local governments here in Johnson County, to come together for this event. And this is about inclusion. This is about issues very directly related to what we face here in Iowa and Iowa City and in Johnson County, surrounding environs. Let me just remind people, if you are, I was not aware of this rule, but if you're a member of a city council or a county board of supervisors, and if there's a majority of people from your same board in the room, either you have to kick somebody out or you're not allowed to speak in the Q&A. We'll have a Q&A afterwards. So it's, that's otherwise, because this is a public event, it would be treated as a public meeting and would be governed under the public meetings rule and stuff like that. And we don't want to go too far with that. So I have to just briefly, pardon me for reading, but the book that this talk is based on is Leading the Inclusive City, Place-Based Innovation for a Bounded Planet, which was published, I think, 2014 or 2015. 2015. And so it's brand new, hot off the press. And it deals with the issue of making cities inclusive. I don't want to give it away. There is a wonderful introduction to the book. And do we still have those discount forms as well? Do we still have the discount forms?
Yeah, we do.
Oh, good. All right. Okay, good. We don't have the books here. Robin came all the way from England, so he didn't bring books. But he did bring discount forms. You get a 20% discount. But I have to read this because this is a long title. And in fact, this will take about 30 minutes. Robin Hambleton is professor of city leadership in the Center for Sustainable Planning and Environments, faculty of Environment and Technology at the University of the West of England, Bristol, and director of Urban Answers, a UK-based company at www.urbananswers.co.uk. And Robin I knew Robin when he was dean of the CUPA, the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois at Chicago. In fact, one of his students was Jeff Fruin, who's, as we all know, is interim city manager of the city of Iowa City. I enjoyed meeting Robin at that time, but he has unlike a lot of academics, including myself, he has a very diverse background, a lot of experience, not only as an academic, but also in public practice. And so he's involved with consulting, but he's also obviously an academic. And this is obviously a great piece of academic work, but it's done in close contact and participation with practitioners throughout the world. It really brings a global perspective. So I am going to let Robin take the floor, because obviously he has something to say.
I need to use the mic?
You can use this if you want to.
Okay. I have a lapel mic on, but I'm not sure. Can you hear me? Am I okay and clear? Fantastic. Good to check, Jim. Thank you. Chuck, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thank you, Jim, for inviting me to come and contribute to your thinking here in this fair city. I'm really honoured and delighted to be here. So Chuck said a bit about me. I just want to say one extra thing. My background is in government. So early in my career, I worked in different cities in England and then became an academic later on. And I like to think, and you can judge this later, that it's really important for people in academe to engage actively with practice and for people in practice to engage with academe. I think this is a two-way street, and universities can benefit from engagement, but equally local communities and civic leaders and so on. So I really believe in applied scholarship. I'm going to do a tiny bit of audience research, if that's all right. You know a bit about me, but I don't know much about you guys yet. And I think from what you said, we have got, and I do know, we have got some elected politicians in the room. We've got some councillors. Could you, if you're an elected member, could you raise your hand so people can see? Oh, oh, wow, excellent. Thank you very much. By the way, you can. It's not there only one. Excellent. Thank you. I think we've got some from the university. Can we see who from the university? Okay. Anyone who sees themselves as being in Britain, we call it the. Okay. There's one in the room. This talk is not what they thought it was going to be about, and they want to get out, but it's too embarrassing to get. Okay. Well, thank you for that. There's a reason for asking, because I'm going to talk about civic leadership. I call it place-based leadership, and the people in this room are all leaders, and I want to suggest to you that bringing together these different backgrounds are really important in good city leadership. I'm going to divide this talk into three parts. The first part is about urban trends in the world. So I'm stepping a long way away from the state of Iowa in this beginning, looking at what's happening to urbanization around the planet. Then I will talk about place-based leadership and give you some examples of inspirational leadership that might stimulate fresh thinking here or may encourage new ideas. And then the third bit would be to just push a little bit further on the idea of leading innovation, which is actually quite difficult, but what we really need in the modern times we're in. In other words, creating, I call it experimental local authorities and city councils and encouraging that kind of behaviour. So that's a trailer. In the book, I have 17 examples of inspirational leadership from different countries, and it covers every continent. Chuck mentioned I've been quite lucky in my work to work internationally quite a lot, and I thought I would try and pull in some ideas from very different places that could be shared. So some scholars focus on problems and difficulties and the challenges we face, and we need them to do that. But this book is much more about to improve things. So it's values. I'm a values person like everybody else in this room, and I'm writing about values in the ideas of leadership. There's quite a few pictures, so that might be enjoyable. All the images are of cities that are in the book. I'm not going to talk. I'm going to talk about a few to illustrate the argument. But I've got pictures of some that are not in the talk. That's Portland, Oregon. in terms of progressive thinking, but also case studies is about the role. Okay, let me move to an opening slide about, this is about the fact that cities are wonderful places. We're very lucky in the modern times to be able to enjoy cities. Because sometimes those of us in urban studies focus on all the problems and difficulties, and we may actually forget. So here we've got Chicago, Copenhagen, Freiburg, Malmo, Ahmedabad, Hamamatsu, Auckland, and Guangzhou. There are 8 of the 17 cities in the book. And I just wanted to put a slide up about the fact that cities are life-enhancing, and we're fortunate to have wonderful cities. Let me go on and talk around the urban trends that I mentioned. What we've got here, and I'll do it instead, of the world's only 13% of the population on the planet lived in cities. This has changed. In 2014, it was 54%. So the demographers argue about the date, but it's around about 2008, the world went urban. Before that date, most people alive on the planet did not live in cities. And after that date, so we've become urbanized as a planet.
How do you define a city?
It's a good question. This is the UN World Urbanization data. And it's a really good question because different countries define urban slightly differently. So this is not a very accurate science. Let me explain. In Canada, I think urban is, I think I've got this right, is defined as anywhere above 30,000 population. But I think in Japan, it's quite a lot smaller. So urban, it's take it with a pinch of salt. They have at least 15,000 people in a place for it to be urban for the UN. And obviously you've got bigger cities that are urban. So it's a really good question because we've got very small urban areas as well as very big ones. If we look ahead, people living in cities goes up. That's sort of quite striking, but the next graph is the same time periods, but with actual figures. So if we just look at the actual numbers from the same source of data and the same time period, 220 million in cities in 1900, moving up 732 million. Have a look at the next one. The world's gone urban by now. So 2011, more than half of the world population are in cities. I think this might be the most important step in this. By 2030, there will be 5 billion people living in cities. Okay, let's just go to the end of the graph. 6.3 billion. So this urbanization of the planet is unprecedented in human history. This has never happened before. But I want to point to that jump from 3.6 to 5 billion. The 5 billion is not a long time. That's 15 years away, 2030. Well, it's actually less than 14 years. So this steep urbanization is happening now very fast. The gap there between 3.6 and 5 is like having 175 cities the size of London, which is 8 million, created in that very short period. So I'm just wanting to suggest to you we are in an urbanizing world, and even in, I know Iowa is a very rural county and you're an agricultural area in terms of the planet, but even in Iowa you're urbanizing, I think. I've got that sense. Not at this pace, but we could talk about that later. Okay, I think I've just got 2 more illustrations for you. Same UN source, by the way, all the time. The UN population data website, if you want to look at cities around the world and size and trends, it's fantastic. That is a picture of the 20 largest cities in the world in 1950. So the biggest city in the world then was New York City. I think it doesn't matter if I get these figures slightly wrong. It's about 11.5 million now. And Tokyo was a little bit smaller. But you can see where the 20 were. The blue bar is in proportion to the size of the population. So we're going up to 20 million on this chart. Just have a look at that. Just try and hold it in your mind for a moment. I'm going to go to 2025. You can see where North America has quite a few of the major cities in the world in 1950, as does Europe. I'm now going to just try and hold that in your mind. It's the same map, and the blue bars on the next map are to the same scale as this map. It's quite a change. So have a look at Europe. There's no megacities in Europe in this period. In North America, at the greater LA and the greater New York are still in the top 20. But look at the size of these cities, the scale. I've had to double the scale from 20 million tops to 40 million tops. Tokyo is the biggest city in the world projected in 2025. It's about 35 million. The top 10 cities on this map are all more than 20 million. In other words, a mega city is 10 million. 10 of these are double mega. That's big cities. But maybe just as important, there's a redistribution of where cities are. This growth is taking place mainly in developing countries. Oh, you can see China, but India, and we'll see more in Latin America and in Africa. So the geopolitics of urbanization globally is shifting in quite an interesting way. I've got my last comment about this. Sometimes I've been tripped up and people said, Robin, this is a bit misleading. That 1.4 billion growth that I mentioned before, most of it will not be in the megacities. I think this is interesting. The megacities, these huge cities, are important for the planet. But most of that growth will be in cities of less than 5 million. So that urban expansion that I mentioned, which is very dramatic, will actually be dispersed across a large part of the world, including quite a bit actually in North America. So that's all I wanted to say in my first part. It was just to give you a sense we're in an urban era, and urbanisation is gathering pace and presents challenges for city leaders, really quite significant ones. Having said that, some cities are shrinking, so there's a different kind of challenge. And some of you, is anyone familiar with Detroit in the room? Anyone from Detroit or no Detroit? Maybe, but you've got some awareness. There you have, because of the economy changing, there's been a dispersal of population. So the city's population is less than it was. So that's a different kind of challenge. We mustn't forget that. Okay, that's enough on urbanised trends. I want now to talk more. That was really a context a little bit for this idea of place-based leadership. That is a picture of where I live. That is Bristol in the southwest of England. It's 2 hours west of London. And we have a directly elected mayor in Bristol who's very enthusiastic about the city and is a good leader. But I'd be in deep trouble if I went back to Bristol and I met up with him. He said, and I told him I'd been to the States. He said, you did show them a picture of Bristol in your presentation, didn't you? Whatever you do, never mind what you said. I think my opening slide was of the Clifton Suspension Bridge at the top. You remember that blue slide at the beginning? There was a bridge. You can see it at the top. We're quite proud of this. This is a little digression. That was the largest suspension bridge in the world when it was built in the 1860s. We're going back. There are a few bigger ones. I think I've heard of the Golden Gate. I think that's about 10 times as big. But at the time it was built, it was a big achievement. In the centre, see that arc building? That's the City Hall and the College Green. And you get a sense, well, I'm lucky we are in a prosperous city, but we also have significant challenges in the city. So all the cities I work with, I think this is true. Even very successful ones, and I think Bristol is very fortunate, we do have deprivation and we have some serious challenges of inequality that the mayor is trying to address. So what's slightly sad is, even though we've got wealthy cities, we seem to be creating more unequal cities. And this is really why this book is about inclusion. We need to build and create more inclusive cities. And luckily for us, quite a lot of places are doing that, and we can learn ideas from them. So the power of place-based leadership. I want to give one of the examples now. This is Melbourne in Australia. And all the stories in the book are about places that are now quite well respected, if not highly respected, but they were not always like that. So Melbourne, in 1978, this is a journalist writing in the local paper, it's called The Age. That's a photograph of the central part of Melbourne, and he described it as an empty, useless city centre. This is in 1978. He didn't mince his words. Very critical. Local newspapers can be very critical of local councils. I'm sure that might be true even in this fair city, and that's part of what we have in. We want an independent media bringing their critical eye. But this was quite strong criticism. Our planners lack the courage to bring our cities back to life. And he's called Norman Day, this guy, and he was right. And there's lots of pictures in this issue. So this is what has happened is. It's a big, there's a big civic centre in Melbourne, and you had a high number of employees working in the offices downtown, a lot of public buildings, but also businesses. And then at night, they all went home. So the centre of the city was dead, and actually potentially unsafe, because there'd been no sound planning. Now, this is where the story improves. The Economist, which is a highly respected independent source of evidence, they've rated Melbourne, and it's probably been either number 1 or 2, as the most livable city in the world for 5 years in a row. So this is not the most livable city in Australia. This is the most livable city in the world. Now, you could argue about what criteria they're using. Is the evidence sound? You know, maybe somewhere, maybe Copenhagen's just as good. You can have a debate, but I don't mind that debate. The main point is, this is not like it was. It's transformed. So these are just 1 or 2 pictures of it. What's happened is the local politicians in the early 1980s decided they were going to do something about this dreadful city centre. And they decided, as a group, that the public realm was the most important thing for the city. That they wanted to create and transform the public realm, meaning the physical public realm, but also the spaces for discourse in the city. They appointed an urban designer. He's called Rob Adams. Some of these stories get back to an individual, so it's quite inspiring. An individual has been really influential. Rob Adams is City Design Director for Melbourne. He's been the City Design Director for 25 years. And he's still there, and he's still doing great work. He's passionate about the city, and it's not just Rob, there's a whole team and a lot of other people. But they decided to make very strong requirements on the private sector if it wanted to invest in their city. So we call it development control in Britain, but it's about the zoning and the regulations and the private sector having to perform to improve the public realm. Otherwise, you can't develop. A very, very pushy public sector. So you have good city planning. There's this new master plan, bringing people back into the city. I think there were 200 or 300 people lived in the centre of Melbourne back in 1978. Now it's 23,000. So you bring a lot of people back into, change this economy of the central area, a much more 24-hour lively place. Cars out, a lot of closing the cars out of the spaces. Bike lanes, encouraging small businesses, super public transport. You can move around the centre. I think it's a very safe place. I think there's good research. Female academics have done research on how women feel in this place all the time. And it's really a success story. So it's in the book because it's just absolutely stunning, from being very very critical, you saw a really very unsatisfactory place to a very highly respected place, as measured by independent people. I'll give you 1 or 2 more stories later, but there's a risk with doing a talk like this that you just hear more and more examples of places, and it's hard to make sense of it. So now I'm going to go into some concepts to help understand place-based leadership. So this is getting a little bit academic, so bear with me. the argument goes that in any place there is a system of, I call it place-based governance. So if you want to keep linking it back to this city, that's fine, that might help you. You might say, yes, we have a system, we have a city council, we have actually more than one city council in this conurbation. There's an arrangements for governing the place. We can come back to the detail in a minute. Whatever the place-based governance, I'm suggesting to you that those leaders are influenced by 4 sets of forces that diminish the amount of space they've got to do things. In other words, they can't do anything they want because the world's not like that. It might be nice if you could and just change things. No, there are forces constraining. At the bottom are environmental limits. So if you think about the climate change challenges that we now have, and it's great what happened in Paris in December when the nations of the world agreed targets on carbon reduction. You'll know about that. They failed a few years ago in Copenhagen. Now there's a recognition of that challenge. So we know about global warming. This is not in dispute. The scientific evidence is enormous. So we have to build more sustainable cities. And if you look at this square, that's the only side that's got solid lines on it. Now, we could have a debate and you might want to come back, but for me, it's just non-negotiable. We can't keep exploiting the planet the way we have been doing. Otherwise, we are not going to survive. The planet's going to survive. It's whether we'll be on it in the longer term if we don't become more attentive to sustainable development. The other 3 sides are more malleable. There's some space here that can be negotiated. On this side are economic pressures. And I think this is more vivid in the USA because the role of the state in the US is not as well resourced as it is in many, European countries. So we've got a bit more asset in some of our countries in Europe to take on the economic forces. This is not a criticism, it's just wherever you are, there's some economic forces, meaning your place has to compete somehow in this globalized world that we all live in. So you want to attract businesses, you want to attract talent, you want a successful local economy to create jobs for people, to have a good quality of life. So a city leader who ignores the economic context is probably not going to be a very good leader, right? However, the economic force is not the only thing. There are people living in cities. I call it the socio-economic framing forces. So people living in a city will have views about what they want their city to be like. Like you might think, I want to be able to walk from home to take my kids to school and I want it to be safe and that should be part of the city and I want it to be like that in my city. Or I'm really keen on cycling and I want to see cycling enhanced. I've got all the values we all have impact on our civic leaders. So the civic leaders all the time are having to balance, and this is not, I send my praise out to everyone elected to public office in the room. This is a very demanding job because you've got the conflicts on you all the time, haven't you, and the conflicting pressures. And you do things the best you can and someone's going to be unhappy, even if it's very wise what you do. So the conflict in cities. I haven't found a city anywhere where there's not conflict. But let's not get worried about conflict. That's okay. Democracy requires conflict. It's not a bad thing. At the top is the governmental framing. This is the last bit of the jigsaw. So above the level of the city or the place-based governance, there are arrangements for giving power to that locality. So in your situation here, there's a state level of government, and then there's a federal government. In my country, we're not federal, so it's straight up to central government, and that gives powers and functions to the elected local council. And the arrangements is quite interesting. It varies enormously around the world how much framing from the government there is. I'll give you a little example. In Sweden, I think it's 80% of the population of Sweden pay no income tax to central government. Don't pay any at all. Only the wealthy Swedes pay a little bit to the central state. The local government has all that income. So it has an enormous amount of spending power. The voter turnout in local elections in Sweden, in my country it's about 38-40% in a local election. I was doing some work in Sweden recently, and they're worried because the voter turnout in local elections is in danger of dropping below 70%. It's a very different place. Why is that voter turnout and civic engagement so high? We can have a lot of argument about why that's the case. In my view, it's partly because they're really powerful organisations that make a big difference. So citizens go to vote because it actually trying to change the quality of life in the place. There's a lot of power locally. In my country, the central state is very oppressive. Our local authorities have been weakened over the years, so that our local leaders, the local mayor, can't do as much as the mayor or leader in Sweden because the central state's spelling out requirements. And I think, and we can debate this later, in Iowa State, I think the state seems to be quite powerful and maybe limiting what you'd like to do at the more local level. But this, I only came to Iowa last night, so I'm not going to try and make too many claims about what I know about the city. Though Jim did take me around to show me a little bit earlier today. Thank you, Jim. So that's a framing that might help you think about the space. At any time, it's malleable, so local leaders can expand the space if they can get public support to increase it. Next slide is about these realms of leadership. You know we did a little hands up at the beginning, and this is a very simple concept that I've found quite helpful in understanding what's going on in these different cities. I'm suggesting to you there are 5 realms. So at the top, we've got political leaders. There are people who are elected to serve public purpose, and they are really important public leaders. And you could make a good case saying they are the most important because we've elected them. And in different countries, there's different ways of electing people, like councillors, or it might be directly elected mayors. Some countries have proportional representation, so marginal voices get into the system. Germany's quite strong on that. They're elected, and they have legitimacy, these people, from the ballot box. Over here, and we've got quite a few in the room, I call them the public, managerial and professional the public servants. So city managers and staff who work in public organs, city planners, and I was a city planner for a bit, and then city management, I would fit in that box there. Very important public leaders. They bring professional and managerial skill to the governance of the place. Chances are they're full-time. They might not all be full-time. That's fine. They're not there because they're elected. They're there because they've been appointed with their skill set to help run the city. Sometimes I work with public managers, and they don't see themselves as leaders. They often say, well, Robin, I can see something here, but we're not leaders. It's the politicians who are the leaders. It's not us. And I always say, no. You are important civic leaders in your place. Just think about what you're bringing to the conversation. And it's not that you're trying to take over from the politicians and say, we're better leaders than the politicians. No. It's about acknowledging there's a leadership capacity here in an organisation. And I think good local authorities, that interface between the politicians and the officers, we call it member-officer relations in England, is very important. If you can get that effectively working, you draw strength from both. The grey areas I call innovation zones. These are spaces where people move out of their comfortable zone, perhaps, to one that's a little bit more uncomfortable. It might be a bit tricky. Some of this is not so familiar. So the top 2 there, that's the state. I'm simplifying now. There's going to be elected people and public servants. And you might say, what are these other 3? This is getting a bit complicated. These 3 are not the state. So in the leadership of a place, we want the state to be effective, but we also want to draw on the talents of people who are not in the state. So business leadership matters, and it varies by country and city. But often the business community can bring a lot of important leadership skill to the governance of a place. In my last job, you mentioned, Chuck, I was in Chicago. I was at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And I had to a steep learning curve to find out how that city works, different from Europe. The business community is very active in advocating for Chicago. It has done for 150 years. You know, they call it the Windy City, don't they, about the claims that people make. Is anyone from Chicago? I'm going to be in deep trouble. Oh, here we are. But you know what I'm saying. There's something there about loyalty and identity with the city that business leaders bring. So not all businesses are that bothered in the place, but quite a lot are. The trade union movement can be very important in the governance of a place. And again, it varies by country and context. But they often are doing more than just leading their members. They're thinking about the place where their members live and working in a broader way. I think the one on the right is a tricky one. Community leadership, it's a bit of a catch-all, but it's all those figures who are active in the community trying to shape what happens in the city. So it's quite a lot, all the activists, the different organisations around particular interests. Groups might be working on the homeless or public transport or all the issues that people campaign on. But also religious institutions can be very important in some cities. Also the universities or academics can be seen as part of the community of a place. They're scholars, but they're also in the community. So just to highlight the innovation zones, it's the areas of overlap where if the process is well led, you can orchestrate, I call it processes of discovery. So if you think about Melbourne, just for a minute, I give you a very quick cameo on it. The political leadership was really important in getting this new way of thinking about the city centre, but they were very good at delegating a lot to the public servants. And I won't get too much detail, but highway engineers were very dominant inside the city council back in the 60s and the 70s, building the roads. And the politicians more or less said, we value what you're doing, but you're going to have to rethink what your work is. We don't want you working to increase traffic flow around our city centre. We want you to work with Rob Adams, our new urban design director, to think about redesigning the streetscape and the public realm to meet the needs of people, make it a people-focused engineering. Not quite forget about the cars, but you've got to switch. So the engineers lost power, and they weren't happy at first. But then the good ones could see there was room for their work to contribute, but not in the way they'd been trained. Okay, and then the community were quite active in Melbourne, pushing for change, and the business. In the case studies, the balance of influence from these different realms varies. And I think it's fair to say that diagram is a bit neat and simple, and you're probably thinking, in my experience, it's a bit more complex than this, and there's overlaps, and some of us are in more than one realm, and you would be absolutely right. But as an academic, I'm trying to simplify this a bit so we can think more clearly about it. So that's what conceptual frameworks do. Okay, next diagram is not new information. It's the last two slides put together, and that's my overall framework. So those four sets of forces that I mentioned that are impacting on the governance of a place, and inside the place, realms of leadership. And in some places, one realm might be very dominant or two. In others, it might be more mixed. And the realms can shift in influence over time. Last diagram on the concepts now, it's the same information, but some people might like it in this presentation. The environmental limits are not going away. The agency exercised by civic leaders, that local leadership, is still there, and it's impacted by those three forces, the governmental, social, cultural, and economic. The place-based leaders take action, and they innovate, and hopefully they create new practice and new institutions, and that's how cities learn and develop and improve, and the lesson drawing goes back. And it may be that you expand the space that you've got by doing this well. I hope that's not too abstract, but I'd like to go on and give you another example. I think it might come clear as I give you one or two more examples. Okay, we're going to New York City now. I was thinking about examples because there's lots of ones I could pick, but I thought this might be a nice one, partly because we are in the US, and I think this is just fantastic, this story. This is an elevated railway. You're looking down Manhattan here. This is on the west side. If you go right back in your history, you'll know this better than me, you had the massive amounts of freight coming into the docks at the bottom of Manhattan, and a lot of that freight came up this railway and out into the continent. Then the highways got built, and you moved to moving your freight on highways. I'm simplifying a lot here. So the road network's carrying the freight, and this railway, it's elevated, it's about 2 stories high, becomes disused. So it's sitting there, right, block after block of it, right down the west side of Manhattan. In 2001, well, before that actually, quite a lot of developers, this is Manhattan, right? Talk about property values. They were keen to get rid of this structure. So it's an old, dilapidated structure. We want to get rid of it. We could redevelop it, and improve Manhattan. Let's get rid of it. Mayor Giuliani said yes. Okay. He signed the demolition order to actually knock it all down and have a fresh start. That line happens to go through 2 gay neighborhoods. And I like this story because there were 2 guys, Joshua David and Richard Hammond, who are just 2 gay guys. They're not urban designers or planners or lawyers or anything like that. They just happen to live near this High Line. And they quite liked it because it's part of the history and it's just a structure, part of the old, the history, and just should this be got rid of? There's a wonderful book on the High Line that details this story. But what you got was the beginnings of a movement of people just meeting, not just gays, but the gays were quite important in the beginning, to say, well, maybe there's some real potential with this structure here. Maybe it shouldn't be demolished. So you have local community action resisting City Hall. And there's a story in the book about how they did it. And they built alliances. They got a photographer to photograph it. It was quite interesting. And they had an art exhibition of photography of this structure and what it was like. So suddenly people kind of realised what was there, a bit of education. A local councillor, politicians, so I think maybe Giuliani was wrong. Maybe there is something here that could be saved. And then eventually it was Mayor Bloomberg, I think, give him credit, said, listen, let's hold off on this demolition and look at what can be done. So he put the planners and the designers and the architects and all the rest to work to see, can you do something with this? Is there a way of doing it? And what you've now got is the High Line Public Park. Has anybody in the room been on the High Line Public Park? Okay, well, I'm sure you're going to back me up on saying this is really quite a special public space. It's right in the intense urban environment, but it's really quite peaceful because you're up from all the vehicles, yeah? It's very, that's a picture of it. They've designed it very well. You can see the old rail tracks there. They're trying to remind us of the history. Lots of social and community events are going on it all the time. I went there just this last year, and I think the numbers visiting the High Line were 6 million last year. I think I've got that right. I don't know what the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art is. I really don't know. I ought to look it up. But this is an incredible attraction for visitors to New York, as well as being great for local people to use. Best thing is this is public realm. It's like the Melbourne story. It's public realm. This is not gated off for certain people to have. It's inclusive. It's inclusive city planning. And it gets right down to quite a few access points for people who need to use wheelchairs, but also parents with buggies to get up onto that. So it's you can get in there and get off quite easily. And I'm just an anecdote. I think I want to trademark this as an indicator of urban success. I've never seen so many people in New York City holding hands as on the High Line. Well, you get the courting couples and the little kids and everything. And I think it might be a signal of a good thing. If people are holding hands, there might be somebody's doing something right, I think. So just going back to the realms of leadership that I mentioned before, in this story, the politicians and the City Hall public servants were going the wrong way. The mayor, maybe the public servants didn't want it demolished, but the fact was it was going to be, the authorities were going to get rid of it. And it was local community activity that saw possibilities that the state did not see. So this is local leadership from outside the state. Now, give the state credit, there's some fantastically good planning work done, and there's been some redistribution of land values, so that in some cases, I think the developers have done quite well. Okay, they didn't get it demolished like they wanted. I think some of them realised this is a lot better now, and there's some displacement of values, so you've got development nearby. There's some quite good legal work. You know, some of the planners in here would understand this. I know you would, Karen. So it's just another example of very successful place-based leadership. This is a dilapidated structure that's going to be gone. Now, it's probably recognised. I think it is one of the most successful public parks in the world. Lots of other cities are looking at their High Lines now thinking, wow, let's go to New York and see whether we might borrow some ideas. Okay, that's the second part. On to the third part, and I'm not going to keep going too long because it'd be good to get some debate and questions and reactions. That's Guangzhou, which, you know that map I showed you with the massive megacities in 2025? Guangzhou is one of those. So it's projected to have a population of over 20 million. And I guess that's a bit different from the challenges in this city, but I just wanted to throw a big one in so you could see, well, how would you do place-based leadership in a double megacity? So this is perhaps off on a little bit of a tangent. There's a city called Curitiba in Brazil, which invented, there's local leaders, they're in the book, they invented bus rapid transit. I'm slowing down a bit here because certainly when I talk in Europe, and I think it's true in North America, in both our continents, we have not got any bus rapid transit. Sometimes I do this, people say, oh, you mean like the bus lanes that we've got? We've got bus lanes in Bristol. No. This is bus rapid transit. So if you just look at it, you've got road space there where a giant proportion of the road space is taken away from the cars. And instead, you put in, a good way to think of it, is a surface subway. So there's no cars going down this bus area. You've got buses, and there are different designs in different places. But Curitiba invented it, city planners and politicians. Guangzhou, if I go to Guangzhou, in around about 2008, we got, is the research student from Guangzhou in the room? Is she here? Yes, she is. Hi. You must be careful. You must correct me if I get this wrong, because we have someone who knows Guangzhou a lot better than me. We met this morning briefly. Thank you for saying. And congratulations. I gather you got through your exam today. Very good. Yes, I think so. Well done. So the city was becoming more and more congested with traffic congestion. Wealth is increasing in China, so people can start to afford to buy cars. It gets worse and worse and worse. Pollution, absolutely terrible. City jammed up. So the mayor starts to think, what can we do about this? What can we do? And they'd heard about Latin America, where Curitiba was so successful, many other Latin American cities did the same. They create a bus rapid transit system that can move people around fast, and it gives poor people access to jobs. That's why they did it in Curitiba, really. And it can match the performance of a metro at 1/10 of the cost. Just think about that for a minute. So a metro, you'll know your own favourite metros. I always think of the London Underground, but any subway system. If they're really good, they can get 25,000 people an hour in one direction on a metro. The trains are coming, off you get the train. They can do 25,000 an hour at peak times on the buses, on the BRT. So they can match a metro, and the metro costs 10 times as much. So if you're a poor country or a city that's not got much in the way of resources, which is why Curitiba did this, you can get incredible performance by doing things differently. Problem, the motorists don't want you to do this. This was congested before they started to take the road space away. So there was quite a lot of protest in Guangzhou against this. People, particularly when they started to construct it. So the leader had to think, am I going to get away with this? And this isn't a state with a very strong government, as we know. But even there was a wavering. But credit to them, they modified the design a bit, but they carried on and they introduced it, and they're now planning to try and extend it. But it's the largest BRT in Asia. And it helps a lot of people get to work. And it's, did you say you went to work on it? You've used it quite a bit. Do you want to comment at all?
I ever use the BRT. The BRT in Guangzhou is not very long, but we can use it very efficiently because we just need to spend the maximum minute is just wait 3 minutes, and then we can wait for the bus, and then we can go to the bus and to our
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. I think they're trying to record this, so I'm not sure we'll pick that up, but we'll get a mic out later, perhaps. Okay. So it's an example of leaders coming under a critique and then continuing to do something. I'll give you one more because I quite like this in English one, a bit biased now. In London, we have a congestion charge that's imposed on motorists driving into the centre of London. And it was proposed in 2000 as an idea for the directly elected Mayor of London to consider. And the Mayor then was Ken Livingstone, quite a progressive politician. And there was enormous opposition that this Mayor might introduce. It was seen in the media as a new tax. And a lot of all the business community was against it. The theatre land people were against it, all the theatres, the meat traders. All the political parties were against him, and his own advisors, the advisors to the mayor, said to him, Ken, don't introduce this congestion charge. If you do, you'll be painted as the mayor who introduced a new tax, and you'll be gone. Wait until you get re-elected. You were elected in 2000. He's going to be up for election in 2004. It's a 4-year term. And they said, wait until 2004, get re-elected, then do it. He ignored all of them, everybody. He ignored. He said, no, we're doing it now. We're doing it in 2003. And he introduced it. It was really touch and go whether it was technically feasible to do it, because you have to have the technology to read all the numbers. And then in 10 days, his approval ratings went up 10% in 10 days. Because why? Because all this traffic wasn't coming into the centre. It was just a transformation. Suddenly you've got this green, pleasant place in the centre of London. And he vowed to put all the money from the charge into public transport. And he did. So when he went to the election in 2004, the guy who introduced the new tax went up in his voter support quite substantially. So I use this with my students along the lines of saying, sometimes you need to resist all the focus groups and all the pressure and point the way and go with it. And it's quite inspirational. The new mayor, we have a mayor now, a Conservative mayor, Boris Johnson. You've probably heard of Boris Johnson. Some of you might have heard of him. Has he got rid of the congestion charge? No, of course not. It's such a sensible thing. So there's nobody talking about getting rid of it. So it's a nice example of bold civic leadership in the face of pressure. And that's what the mayor in Guangzhou did also. So sometimes leaders have to listen, but sometimes they have to not listen. Yeah? And sometimes they have to be courageous. Okay, I think I've got 2 more examples, then I'm done. It's not such a good photo here, but this is an informal settlement on the edge of Stellenbosch in South Africa. When informal settlement, I think of shacks that have been created by very poor people to live somewhere. This is dominant in the developing world. And you might say, that's going to be a complete shambles, whatever happens. No, it can actually be planned a little bit. So these are planning students from the University of Cape Town who are working with the residents in an informal settlement to think about how can we reshape these shacks and do something to try and, this is really, we're talking very fragile resources here, to make it better than it is. And they call it a taps and toilet strategy. These are the 2 T's. Really what you need if you're living in a place like that is somewhere where you can get some water and also some toilets. So they've got 1 or 2 of those stations in, but they also reshape the shacks a bit. So you've got avenues and you get some light in there. It's like classic old-fashioned city planning. And then a community development around the central area, and a ladies' hairdressers became a really important part of the community development of improving the quality of life of that community. The people there mainly working, picking in the vineyards, working there. So I threw that one in because some people say, oh, well, you're talking about Guangzhou or New York City, really big cities with lots of money, they can do things. This has got trivial amounts of, they've got virtually no money, but they can still do something creative with local leaders. Because lo and behold, the local leaders living in this settlement were quite quick to respond, and they organised a kind of representative system of voices across it, a bit like a representative democracy. So it's quite inspiring what they've managed to do. It won the prize for the best community development in South Africa the year that they did this. Now, this is my last example, and I think I've left this till last, partly because I think it might be most relevant to Iowa, and to Iowa City in particular, and you can tell me if I'm right on this. That's two pictures of Freiburg in southern Germany, which is a town with about a population of 220,000. So it's not it's not a great big city. Let me start off by saying, in my city, where I live in Bristol, I have electricity in my home, and I pay a bill to the electricity company for having it. I imagine it's like that in this city, that you've got something coming in and you pay. This is in Vauban, on the south side of Freiburg, and it's not all the houses, but quite a few of the houses are so well designed with their solar power and insulation and systems. They have all the power they need from natural resources in a household and have spare electricity. So they sell their spare electricity to the grid. So they're so ahead, they have an income from their electricity. Can you see where I'm going? And that, it is a very green city. It's got a green mayor. We have a green party in Europe, and it's led by the Greens. It's very, very progressive on green values. This is a little kiddie on a bike in Vauban. You can't take your cars into Vauban. You can live in Vauban, you can have a car, but you keep your car outside the neighbourhood because we don't want cars in the neighbourhood. We want to be able to live totally safely in this space and have little kids cycling and doing whatever they want. People-friendly, safe design. You can take a car, say you've got somebody who's infirm or ill or something, you want to go, you can go in very slowly and get to, it's not like you can't ever take a vehicle in, but it's like switching the model of we have to get out of the way for the cars. It's more the cars have to get out because we're living in this neighbourhood. Very strong community involvement in the shaping of the design. Very good public transport. Car ownership is going down in Freiburg. It's a prosperous city and car ownership's going down because a lot of people living there, why do I want a car? I can do everything I need without it and I can hire one if I'm going off somewhere further afield. So it's a very green city, and it's been so well thought of. There's a charter for the Freiburg Charter for Sustainable Development. It's on a website, you could look it up. How did they do it? And they've got a charter of their sustainable design principles. It's I'm going to come to the leadership in a moment, but some people say, oh, I can see this as a green city, Robin, but obviously it's not economically successful if they're doing all that. They must have an economy that's on its knees. It's not on its knees. It's one of the most dynamic economies in southern Germany. Why? Because they're the centre of the solar panel high-tech end of green technology. So they're growing and growing their jobs and growing their population. So it's like it's green and economically successful at the same time. And it's hard to do this, but they are doing it, trust me. An American scholar who went over to look at this, one of the best on green policies over here, went and she wrote in her book, she was absolutely astonished. She said it was that what they were doing was already far ahead of anything anywhere in the US was thinking about. So it's very progressive, it's very inclusive, I think. How did they do it? Local leadership. Every one of these stories is about place-based leadership. In 1970, it was not like this. It was pretty ordinary South German town. And again, it was local activists mainly who were pushing these ideas. There was a stimulus. The government would propose to put a nuclear power station nearby, and that kicked up a lot of fuss. People said, we're not having that, and they got rid of it, they beat it out, and then they started to work together to create this different kind of city. Wolf Dasseking is the director of planning. He's a bit like the Rob Adams in Melbourne. He stayed with it. He's recently retired. He was there for 20 years. Absolutely dedicated, working with different politicians at different times. But really quite a success story. And in this case, I think the community activism is very strong. You probably wouldn't live in Freiburg unless you were very keen on green values because it's just part of the culture of the place. It's quite a nice university and economy and stuff. Okay, I've been racing along, giving you a lot. I'm going to give you one last slide now. I thought I'd try and just pull 6 points out. I might be picking up the wrong points, but I thought it'd be helpful if I thought, having just seen a little bit of the city here. I hope I've persuaded you that whilst the world is globalising at a formidable rate, I think that can't be disputed, place still matters to people. So this is all happening, but we still live in places and care about them. place-based leadership can improve the quality of life. And I've just given you a few examples. The book's got 17, but if you look around, there's thousands of cities doing great stuff, often unsung and really important. I like the idea of the innovation zones, these spaces where different voices come together and can create new possibilities. And I think in each of these stories, I'm trying to suggest it wasn't just the politicians did it, or just the officers, or just the... It's often that connectivity between the different realms. I think successful cities keep a sharp focus on inclusion. I've sometimes come across the argument, we can't be worried about inclusion in our city, we want to be economically successful. And I come back and say, well, actually, if you think about inclusion, you might well be more successful than if you don't. It's easy to say, not so easy to do, but I think that the connection should be made. We need to move from reacting to events to being more proactive, to trying to set an agenda, and this is what local leaders do, and they have a vision and push for it, and they stay by it, and even when the flack comes, you can still try and push forward your ideas. Be proactive. But maybe the last point to finish off completely on is the idea of the experimental local authority, where you try things out and do things that are reversible, so that it's not like the end of the world if it goes wrong. My mayor did this a couple of years ago, decided to close parts of the city to cars on Sundays to create a public realm that people could enjoy. Quite a few people were nervous about that, and including businesses that didn't like the idea. He said, look, well, let's try it and see if it works. We can have a lot of community events and stuff in the public realm. So did it, and it was a fantastic success. The next day, the businesses are saying, can we have it every Sunday? So it's something about the leader trying something out. If it had been a disaster, it had cost virtually nothing to just test it and see. So I think being experimental is quite important given the turbulent world that we're now in. Thank you very much.
We have time for Q&A. And so I just want to mention that Germany has Freiburg. We live in Freitown, in a village of 165 people. And we have, at one point, 2 years ago, the state's largest solar array, 5 acres in size. So when people talk about Freiburg in Germany, we talk about Freitown here in Iowa at our own scale. But do we have any questions for Professor Hambleton? Yes, Rod.
Robin, I wonder, there are several places in the world, including here at the University of Iowa, where they're doing work on driverless cars.
Oh.
And it seems to me that a lot of your conversation is about the impact of the automobile and how it interacts with people. And what do you see the future impact of this kind of technology on how we build cities?
Right, that's a really interesting one. I'll confess off the bat, I'm not an expert on driverless cars or that technology, but I think I was slightly surprised when I started to do the research for the book. I didn't expect public transport to come up in such an important way as it did. You know, I mentioned Curitiba and Guangzhou, and if you think about it, it actually is quite an inclusive thing to do if you can put a good public transport system in and keep the prices low to help everybody access jobs around the metropolis. So I think I'm persuaded on the public transport. I think the new technology that you're mentioning, maybe that could even improve access even more. And maybe that technology can help public transport too. You know, there are certain kinds of buses that use GPS so that you don't have a bus route, they move to where people signal they want to go. I don't want to get into a big debate about Uber tonight. The Uber taxi service model is introduced in Britain. It's very controversial, and some people are against it, some people are for it. But there's something interesting about the technology, whether you like their model. And maybe the driverless vehicles will be something that will make a really big difference in the future. It's early days, but it could change quite quickly.
Right now, Iowa City is anti-Uber, I think. Is that right? Don't ask Jim.
So Sort of coming off of the idea of transit, I know that I lived in New York City for 11 years and got very used to mass transit.
Right.
And I know that as this area has grown, I mean, we have Iowa City and lots of other sister cities and other places in the county, access is becoming bigger and bigger an issue. And the economies of scale are not necessarily there for us to be able to leverage transit the way that we might want to. Do you know of any examples of, say, towns that may have been more sort of encompassed and isolated, that then as they grew had to fold these programs in together and had success?
I think Freiburg, Germany, it's quite interesting. They did decide to invest very heavily in their tram system. I mean, maybe that's just one example, but there it's sort of a bit counterintuitive. You know, I showed you some areas that are getting newly built, Vauban and there's others. They have to fund it. They put trams in to areas that are being developed even before there are many people there, because they want the people to feel it's okay, they can still get around the place even though there's no, the area is not fully developed. That doesn't happen in a lot of North American suburbs, in my experience. Often you've got the developers and the schemes get built, and then you get car-borne behaviour because there isn't the public transport there. I think some of this is to do with the history of a country as well, where in Europe there's been tram systems going right back, and in many cities they've managed to keep them. So they kind of realised, maybe not quite fully realising, how good an idea it was to keep the tram system. But we've also got, haven't we, a lot of introduction of metros. That's happening, and that can be very, very important. But I think this bus rapid transit system idea is quite important for developing countries, even though it's controversial and motorists don't like it on the whole. So I think there's a varying practice, but I think it's, in the US, the land is owned mainly by private interests, so it's harder to do. You've got to have a certain density of development around your transit points to make, they call it transit-oriented development, don't we, in the States? You've got to have that ownership or certainly zoning and requirements that can get the density to make public transport work. Though the earlier point about new technology might change that a bit, I suppose.
So one of the questions I guess I have is, in Iowa City, for example, or in Johnson County, we have a lot of cities contiguous with one another in a rural area. Doesn't the fact that we have so many different municipalities and thus governmental units create an additional problem to really looking at a thing like transportation from a total complex? Because, you know, hey, Iowa City's got this, Colville's got this, North Liberty wants something here.
Yeah. It's a really good, I'll stand up so I can see people, you can see me. I'm going to cheer you up a little bit, I hope. In my last job, when I was in Chicago, I discovered that in the greater Chicago, I think I've got this right, Chuck, I think there were 262 municipalities governing the city. So you talk about fragmented metropolis, and that is your problem magnified, isn't it? In my own city where I live, there are 4 local authorities trying to run a city region. And you're absolutely right. Getting good public transport into Bristol is difficult because we've got these different interests, don't necessarily get the bigger picture sometimes. So what do we do about that? I think there's two options, and I don't know if either of these would work in Iowa City. One is a higher level of government. You know, I talked about the governmental framing can actually decide it's going to impose change on the local areas. That's happening now in Britain, actually. So ministers can pass legislation and introduce, it's called the Cities and Local Government Act, so they're going to be forced to work together. This is in January, this new act. I don't sense Iowa State's going to do that because of the politics of the state. So you probably, I might be wrong here, so forgive me if that's not right. But another route is to collaborate bottom up and see possibilities by creating collaboration across these different territories so that everybody benefits. And again, there are some examples of that I think could be useful for you here. Do you think it is an issue here? I get the feeling you think it is a big issue. Yeah. But it's not easy, and in a way, if we talk about this, it's very important to not erode the identity of the different parts of the place, because people feel a lot about where they're from and their place and their locality. So people who want to reform metropolitan government need to be very aware of that. And I think in Britain this model is we're going to keep these 4 unitaries in Bristol, but we will have a strategic authority that goes across them, that doesn't do too much, but it does do transport and economic development and big spatial planning projects, which is like the Greater London Authority. We have done it once before. So there may be different ways of thinking about this. And that metro level benefits all the places. I think you can make that case, but it's quite hard for local leaders to do that because they've got their local voters pressing them to think about this place, not that place. But the really effective leaders can transcend their place and help get something bigger happening. I hope that it's not easy though. You keep pointing out really tricky problems here. Yeah.
Of these urban improvement projects you've shown us, and I'm sure you have others, what has it done to the valuation of homes and apartment affordability?
Right, that's a good question. Funnily enough, I've been talking a little bit today with 1 or 2 people, and affordable housing seems to be a major issue for this city. That's perhaps why you're asking. Right, a lot of the opportunities here are shaped by the higher level of government. I'm not trying to pass the buck here, but in my country, if the central state is not sympathetic to affordable housing, which is now the case, it makes it very difficult for local leaders to do much about it. They can campaign and push and point out the problems arising from not doing this. So if you've got an unsympathetic higher level of government, it's difficult. Having said that, in Europe, there are quite a lot of good examples of what they call it cooperative housing and social housing associations, they're called, that can make a big difference. I think even fairly focused business interests get the problem when they realise that they haven't got any workers coming in the door. So you can try and make the inclusion argument for economic reasons. So in London now, it's very, very expensive to live there. So even teachers and social workers and people like that can't afford to live in London. So people are starting to say, what's happening here? We need to have affordable housing for everyone's benefit. And for less well-paid people, we even need more affordable housing. But you put your finger on a big issue, but it's very hard for the local state to do a lot if higher levels of government aren't sympathetic. I think in other countries, the informal settlements, you get people just creating their housing because the state's not doing anything and the market's not doing anything. So maybe we can learn a bit from them over the long term, where they just create housing. And I'm thinking particularly of Latin America. But it's a tough one, and I think it might be the biggest problem. I speak out of turn, I think, here, but it might be one of the biggest problems for this city, because you've got a student population that's really important for the city, but that can displace other people who are wanting to buy or rent affordable housing. I haven't got a great answer on that one, I'm sorry. I'll do my best. It's a really good question. Yes?
As a brief background, I currently work as a bus operator for CAMBus. I'm not speaking on their behalf, of course, but I'm also interested in going to transportation planning as a career. But my question is that it seems like in many plans, I'm not speaking in any specific plan, but in general, it seems like it's very easy to get input from people in more traditionally considered white-collar positions who have the ability to show up to meetings at 7 or 8 at night, and less so from blue-collar positions such as transit workers in other cities and elsewhere. Could you elaborate on your personal experience in terms of getting input in terms of transportation plans from the actual workers who have the ground zero level insight into how transportation plans end up working?
Right. Specifically on transportation, you're hoping I can... But I think there is a slightly more general point. I think it's a really good point about whose voices get included in the decision-making process. I think that's what you're saying. And I think in some cities, in some countries, there's a decentralisation of power to the local areas that helps more voices get into the conversation. So if I just give you Sweden, I mentioned Sweden before, where you've got these very powerful elected local authorities. If Malmo is in my book, they decentralise power to neighbourhoods within the city. And they are then successful in getting a lot of these voices that you're talking about because it's much more immediate and more local, and they have power to do things in the neighbourhoods. So it's not like just consultation on things. Though they have consulted on transport and restructured transport in Malmo, including putting a new railway in. And I think the worker involvement in that has been really quite important. So it's really partly about where does the power lie and who's making the decisions. And if you can devolve down, I think that can make it more accessible to people who maybe would not want to make a journey to City Hall or something. So it's a bit about having, you know, I talked about innovation zones. Sometimes you create a new space for the conversation to happen, and it might be a bit unconventional, like it might be, okay, it might be in a community building, but it might be in some other kind of place. It might be at the university, actually. Or there's different ways of creating space for voices to be heard. So on the specifics of transport workers, I think there's been some quite good experience in LA. This is not in my book, but people have told me that the transport workers have been quite effective in improving policy for public transport in LA, which is slightly counterintuitive. I'm not sure they would be good, but they had. But in London, going back to Ken Livingstone and the congestion charge, the unions are very actively supporting that move, partly because of political feelings that it's a good way to create a good city, but also their workers would benefit from an expansion of the transport network, and there'd be more jobs in public transport, which has happened, because public transport's been improved a lot. I think it's almost win-win-win, that one, because people then start using the transport more because it's quite fast, and then there's more income comes to the transport, and I don't want to gloss it up too much, but I think it's been quite good. Okay. Okay.
Robin, over here.
Sorry, okay.
No, that's right.
Got you.
I see there's a lot of elected officials in the room and professional planners.
Yeah.
And I'm one of them. I'm not going to tell you which. But I thank you for the presentation. I look forward to reading the book. I'm a firm believer that policy drives the sort of things that you're showing here. For instance, in Freiburg, it was a feed-in tariff in Germany that treated everybody that put up a solar panel or a wind turbine like a producer, and they got their cost of their production plus a guaranteed profit. So that's called the feed-in tariff. In America, solar and wind are driven by tax credits, which has made Iowa #1 in wind, for instance.
Oh, right, okay.
What kind of policies could we pass here at a city level or a county level that might facilitate some of the changes that you advocate here in your book, the place-based learning, or place planning?
Right, okay. Across the board, doesn't matter the substantive focus, right. Well, I'm probably on really thin ice now, so you'll have to help me get to the other side. I think I've tried to make a case for saying more powerful local authorities can make more difference. So I talked about Sweden, but in other countries, you've got really local authorities that are more powerful than I think the municipalities are here. I'm not sure how viable it is to get more power down to the local level, but I would guess any steps you can take to try and increase it, and there might be different ways of doing that, to get more political space. You know, I talked about the political space. It can be expanded if you can get more power down. So maybe that's about lobbying the state and trying to get some ideas into the conversation that they might see as being okay, because you can't be any idea, because they might be quite not ready to listen. So I really don't know quite how to do that here, but you'd be surprised, even interests that might appear to be very resistant to some of these ideas can actually change quite significantly, like the High Line story. The powerful elite of the city were going to demolish this, including the mayor and the business interests, but the campaigning altered the conversation and the decision got reversed. So it's something about expanding the power. Another idea is to try things out and be an experimental place within the powers that you have got, and try and do things that attract interest and get noticed, and then maybe try and bid for support on the back of being an experimental place that's seen as doing good things, maybe taking a few risks, but nothing too risky because you don't want to lose support. But that might be another way of trying to win support for more power. I think you want more power in the locality. We haven't got it in Bristol, but we're trying to get it. But I'd encourage you to try and get more. I hope that helps a bit. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to thank you. I really appreciate the comments about how renewable energy and transportation and parks and public spaces affect an inclusive city. I too, as an elected representative, am not going to say which entity I am a part of, but you'll be able to guess real quick. Because I really appreciate you talking about affordable housing and housing availability. From my entity's perspective, housing policy is education policy. And I'm curious if you have any perspective on how education and accessibility to good schools affects building an inclusive city.
Yeah, it's enormously important. I probably, you can't cover everything in a book, I guess. There isn't much about education in the book, but it is absolutely critical, isn't it, for a lot of reasons in terms of creating opportunity for young people. I guess just as an aside, I think in Britain we have got some interesting experience of learning from the best-led schools on a national basis. So I'm not sure our national government's heading in the right direction on schooling policy. But one thing that's really, I think, quite positive is they've noticed where particular schools have been very successful and they've gone in to find out what was going on in that school. And you've got school leaders being valued, head teachers being valued for being civic leaders beyond just their school, and then some of them getting promoted or taken into positions where they're mentoring other head teachers in other schools. Then some of them are getting into significant roles nationally. And we've got some data now which shows that a school in a deprived area where you might think these kids haven't got so much of a chance because of the backgrounds of the families, where the results are actually matching the well-off areas because of the leadership of the schools, which is quite startling, but there are some examples of that. And in some cases, it's been immigration that's helped, because sometimes it can be a problem if you have a lot of children using English as their second language. That's happened a lot in a lot of our schools. We've got a lot of friends from Europe coming in. But in some cases, they've brought certain ideas about education in their culture, thinking particularly of the Indian community, that then signal what's the school about, and made schools that are quite deprived in terms of the area, in some cases, really quite successful.
We have a question over here.
Got a lady in the middle?
Along the lines of education and inclusion, this city is highly based off the University of Iowa system. Over 30,000 students here in town alone and then surrounding metropolitan area. What advice, one, do you have for someone who's trying to get the student constituency involved, since they're notoriously hard to reach, and just about everything? I think the precinct where I went to vote in the local election had about 19 votes total in the last election cycle last November. And what advice do you have for a student who's trying to get more involved in planning or leading inclusive cities?
Okay. Great, okay, yeah, good, thank you. Just a bit of context here. I know you've got a large number of students in the city. That's a great asset, I think. I mentioned Melbourne and the change in there. I didn't actually say, but there's quite a lot of student housing been put in the central areas. That's part of help to make it a more creative place. Now, I know you've got a lot of student housing here, and I think it makes it quite an exciting place. Probably at night, very exciting. I'm not been out at night here, but that's an asset. And in Bristol, where we overdeveloped the offices, that somebody came to us about 4 or 5 years ago, realised that maybe they could convert these office towers that had been built into student accommodation. And that's happened, and that's really worked quite well. So there's something quite good about having students in a city. Getting students involved in the local politics is, well, you know more than this than I do, but it's a bit tricky because they are probably transient, aren't they? They might stay in the city for a longer period, but I think there might be opportunities for the city council to reach out more to not just students actually, but to different I call them excluded voices. Sometimes people are excluded, there's no intention, it's just that the system isn't very sensitive to where they're at. So moving out of the City Hall into, in your case, it would be, I guess, meetings and settings that are available, more accessible to students. And then I think using social media is another idea. I think some of your presidential candidates have got some experience of this to try and build up, networks around them. So that might help. But maybe the students themselves could have a think about what is it that we feel is important and come the other way. It's not like just, let's wait for the City Council to come and start talking to us. You can actively lobby and press for things. I don't know what they would be. But you want a vibrant local civic society to improve the quality of life in the city, and students need to be part of it. In Bristol, the fact we've got a directly elected mayor, which is new, we didn't have one until 2012, I think it has interested the students a bit because they can see a face. It's a very simple point, but I'm not saying you have to have a directly elected mayor, but I think the faces of politicians matter. It's more personal. So I think our voter turnout on the student side might be better in May because they know this colourful person as the mayor. You might not like him, but at least you know who it is. Hope that helps.
Well, I think that ends our time for Q&A and apparently ends our questions, so that's really terrific. Thank you all for turning out, and above all, thank you, Robin Hambleton, for coming all the way here.